Well, good morning, good afternoon, or well, perhaps good evening, depending on where you're listening from, of course. And welcome to yet another fall publishing webinar. Oh, and before I forget, happy Pi Day. That's 314 for those of you who know your math. And happy National Potato Chip Day, which is much more important to me. Who am I? I'm Chris Beatties, editor of GrowerTalks and Green Profit magazines and the newsletter Acres Online, and I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so as we learn more about making the better mix, wood fiber research, and the benefits of adding HydraFiber. Now, I think this is the third webinar I've done on wood fiber. It is a hot topic. It's been researched and talked about for, well, long more than a decade, but most growers are still confused about it, or it's a mystery to them. What is it? Where does it come from? How do you use it? And most importantly, do plants like it? And is it worth giving a try? And in today's webinar, we hope to answer all those questions. But of course, to do that, I need experts, like experts. And luckily, I've got two of them for you. Let me introduce them right now. Our first is Professor Glenn Fain from Auburn University. Welcome, Dr. Fain.
Good morning.
And I always like to know where folks are broadcasting from when I do webinars with them, because you could broadcast from the beach or the mountains or pretty much anywhere. So where are you sitting today?
Well, Chris, unfortunately, I'm just in my office here at Auburn University. I'm not at the beach and I'm not in the mountains.
I'm sure it's palatial, and you're surrounded by Auburn Tigers memorabilia, autographed footballs, and all that good stuff too, right?
Maybe a little of that.
A little, of course. I've seen you professors' offices. All right, and representing our sponsor, Profile Products, is a veteran of these GrowerTalks webinars, Mr. Daniel Norden. He is the Senior R&D Manager and Technical Specialist Manager for Profile. Welcome, Daniel.
Hey, Chris. Great to be here.
I think your title has gotten even longer since we last did this. You're doing well there at Profile.
Yeah, a little bit longer. That's right.
We're going to need a second slide. And you usually find some interesting places to do these webinars from. So what is your secret undisclosed location today?
Well, I can tell you I'm in my mobile broadcast studio for Hydrofiber in South Carolina.
That means he's pulled over at exit 47 on I-95 on the highway. But hey, as long as you've got an internet connection, it doesn't matter. And
right.
Well, for me, I'm broadcasting from live from the 198th floor of the world famous GrowerTalks Tower from my palatial offices there. But all right, enough goofing around. Couple of housekeeping things before we turn it over to our experts. If you've got questions as we go along, you know the drill. There's a question box over on the right-hand side of your screen. Type them in. If they're pertinent to the topic at hand, we will address them as we go along in that topic. If not, we'll save them for the end. And if it's just too complicated an answer or we run out of time, which usually happens when I host a webinar, we will give you contact information for both Daniel and Glenn so you can communicate with them directly. And everyone always asks, is this webinar going to be archived? They are always archived at the same place you sign up, growertalks.com/webinars, and that should happen within an hour of the conclusion of this. So if you have to leave, take care of a customer, or if you want to share this information with a colleague, that's how you do that. All right, so Dr. Fain, I think you're taking it away. So if you're set, let's do it.
Thank you, Chris. Well, good morning or good afternoon or evening, whatever it should be, to all the growers and industry professionals tuning in today. It's really great to be with you. I thank you for taking your time out on what I'm quite sure is probably a very busy day for you this time of year. Today, I'm really excited to talk to you about a subject that I'm really passionate about. I'm excited that I've been given this opportunity to share, some of the research that I've done leading up to doing research with HydraFiber. And so I've been in substrates for quite a long time, and I'm specifically very passionate about wood fiber substrates at this point in my career. Just to give you a little more background about me, I've had hands in substrates the majority of my life. I was in, I guess, a former life. I was a grower and a propagator in my early career, and for the last 20 years in research and development. And for about the last 15 years, I've been focusing on investigating alternative substrate components, primarily those that are derived from forest and agronomic biomasses. Most of that work has been focused on biomass from southern pine forests. That work actually began as a collaboration with USDA, the Agricultural Research Service, which was where I was located at the time, along with Auburn University, both the Department of Horticulture here at Auburn and the School of Forestry here at Auburn, and also with a very important component of that collaboration was our industry growers and collaborators. And I will also add I had tremendous input and guidance from colleagues at numerous institutions across the country who also work in substrates. Again, this wood fiber work that I've done started when I was a research scientist at USDA at the Southern Horticulture Laboratory, and I was participating in an industry focus group. And out of that meeting, we set a priority on exploring alternative substrates, primarily as a result of those industry personnel's concerns over the cost and the future availability. And our initial work actually focused on container-grown nursery crops, but we quickly moved our primary focus to greenhouse crops, where we saw the potential to have really the biggest economic impact. And so now I must add that we were not the only group investigating the use of forest biomass as a substrate. There was a group at Virginia Tech led by the now retired Dr. Robert Wright. They were looking at a very similar product as to what we were looking at. That work is continued by Dr. Brian Jackson at North Carolina State University. I'm sure that many of you no doubt have seen and read articles by Dr. Jackson on wood fiber substrates. I might also add that wood fiber as a substrate component has been widely investigated in Europe, and there have been many products on the market in Europe for quite a few decades. Now, early, our team made the decision to explore the possibility of using the most widely produced, farmed, if you will, tree in the southeast, and that was loblolly pine, or the Pinus taeta. And we decided to use initially decided to use the whole above ground portion of that tree. Our reason for that decision was that if we could use it, it would be the most cost effective, as there would be no residual waste in the harvesting of those trees. So how do we get from a whole tree to a substrate? Well, the first step in the process is simply the harvesting of pines from a pine plantation, just as a typical forest operation would do when harvesting biomass for paper. The difference in our case is the trees are not delimbed. We're using the whole tree. So those steps involve the felling of the tree, the transporting of the tree to a whole tree chipper, which chip the trees into a trailer for transport out of the forest for further processing. That process, if my slides will advance for me, results in what you see here. Now, I would guess that you could all agree that you're not going to have much luck growing a petunia in something that looks like that. So the next step is to take that product, which you can see there contains quite a bit of wood fiber, but there are pine needles, there's bark, small limbs, again, the whole tree. So we take that product and reduce it into something with the physical properties that we would expect or really demand of a substrate component. So initially we looked at basically three different sizes or grades, if you will. And that's what you see here in this picture. We were using a milling operation where during the milling process, the product had to pass through one of three different screens, and they were processed independently. And the opening size of that screen is indicated here on your monitor, the 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch, or 3/16 of an inch. And the product that was really most attractive to us was the one that had passed the 3/16 inch screen. And the reason for that is, if you'll see here on this graph, we evaluated the physical properties of those three components and compared those to what our grower that we're working with at the time was using, a standard peat-light substrate. And we saw that the 3/16 material closely matched both the airspace and the water holding capacity of our standard. So ideally, if we could use that, that would be the one that we would choose just based on those initial evaluations. One of the things that we were concerned with was how would this product, it has different characteristics, how would it work in the existing equipment, both processing and handling equipment that our grower that we were working with had. And we did experience some issues with flowability of the whole tree. Had some minor bridging issues in their hoppers. It was easily corrected with slight equipment modifications. We also did some slight modifications at the point of pot filling once the substrate had been blended with the other components. We really experienced no issues in transplanting, either hand transplanting or mechanical transplanting, even at high inclusion rates of the whole tree. So we felt really good at this point about the product and as far as the material handling of the product. Now, our research early on focused primarily on inclusion rate. How high could we go? And with that, we wanted to know what effect inclusion rate would have on nitrogen immobilization. We knew that we would see some nitrogen immobilization in this hardwood fiber substrate, but at what degree would that affect us, and would that be a limiting factor in how much we could add into our substrate? We also were concerned about pH management. Peat moss is a great substrate, has good buffering capacity, good physical and chemical properties, but we knew based on some testing that by ourselves and others that this wood fiber was going to have a very low CEC and was going to have a low buffering capacity. And then we're also concerned about water holding capacity and basically just water management as we increase the inclusion rate of the substrate. So, and this slide here is one of our early studies. We were focused on 3 inclusion rates. The first being 20%, where we simply were trying to replace the perlite component in this particular grower that we're working with, substrate. The second was a 50%, where we were replacing the perlite as well as a portion of the peat. And the third was, we were shooting really high. Could we use this at 100%? And again, this initial study, we were looking or focused on the 3/16 inch product, the finer product that gave us the water holding capacity that we were needing. In this study, we also evaluated various starter nutrient charges to address any initial nitrogen drawdown or nitrogen immobilization. And in this picture here, if it's not very clear, let me just kind of describe the layout of the plants here that you see. In columns from your left to right are the starter nutrient charge rates. The first column being 0, in other words, no starter nitrogen added as a nutrient charge, and then that increasing nitrogen rate as you move from left to right in that picture. And then each row is a different substrate, with a peat-light substrate being at the bottom and the 100% whole tree at the top. And so in the picture, as well as in the graph there, I think you can see that as inclusion rate went up, plant size decreased. However, increasing the starter nutrient charge increased the plant size at the higher inclusion rates. Now, here's a picture from a Marigold study, and I put this in here just it's kind of an emphasis that species, we do see differences in species, and we've tested just numerous plants, different species. But Marigold is one that just seems to perform really well, even at high inclusion rates. So this picture visually you see no difference whether of the marigold grown in 100% whole tree on the far left as compared to the peat-like substrate. And all of these marigolds here did have a starter nutrient charge present in the substrate. We were also wanted to see how this substrate would perform on a garden mum crop that was being produced in an outdoor production environment versus a greenhouse environment. So in this study, we actually used one of the coarser grades of the whole tree that had a little more airspace and less water holding capacity. And our standard substrate here was quite a bit different than the greenhouse substrates we've been comparing. It was primarily composed of pine bark and peat, had about 40% peat, about 35 to 40% pine bark, and then also had a couple of other components. And in this study, we compared it to 100% whole tree and an 85% whole tree, 15% peat. And we also looked at starter nutrient charge in this study as well. And as you see in the graph there, as we increased starter nutrient rate, plant growth increased, but throughout the study, this graph is of shoot dry weight of the plants. So the total accumulated biomass of that plant after 84 days of production. And we did see smaller plants with both our alternative substrates, both the 100% whole tree and the 85-15 whole tree peat. And however, if you look at the picture here, and I think you see what you saw in the graph, the plants are slightly smaller, but all the plants at the end of the study were marketable. Now, one thing about this study that we think is a little different, or we feel for sure is a little different than some of the greenhouse studies where we saw the difference is we didn't feel like the plant biomass was as much related to nitrogen drawdown or nitrogen immobilization as it was to water management. And the reason I say this is if you look at this chart of physical properties, because we chose a coarser grind of the whole tree, we actually had a lot less water holding capacity than we did in our standard. And so we felt like that it was more related to, or as much related to water management and water holding capacity as it was to any nitrogen immobilization. Now, I haven't talked much about root performance, but that has certainly been a focus of our work. After all, the primary function of a substrate is to provide a matrix for root growth and development. As a grower friend of mine once told me with decades of experience, if you can provide me with a good root system, I can produce a good plant. Now, while that is somewhat simplistic, I think you would agree there's a lot of wisdom in that statement. So what about roots? Well, just really, and this is a picture of the garden mum study, but with most every study we've seen nothing but optimal performance in rooting. And that was, again, certainly the case in this study. Click on the next picture here, and that's just a close-up there of the 100% whole tree from the mum study. As you can see, it has a very healthy root system. Now, in the fall of 2010, in working with the grower we were working with, I convinced them that we needed to do a larger scale study, if you will, kind of a demonstration. And so I convinced the grower that we could do this with a very high inclusion rate, and we were going to do this with a poinsettia crop. And so he, I would say, somewhat reluctantly agreed to give me quite a bit of space. So we planted 5,000 poinsettias in both 6-inch containers and 10-inch baskets. And I might add, this was really our first study where we looked at propagation, as this was a direct stick production method, as many growers are doing today. Now, we didn't collect really data on this study. It was run more as an informal trial, but I can share with you that the grower assigned to produced this crop to believe that he saw improved rooting and improved root development in the whole tree substrate, compared to the standard. Now, after numerous discussions with the grower, I think this was probably more a direct result of water management, and that he was managing this crop basically from the water management standpoint, the same as he was the plants that were right next to it in his standard substrate. And I think actually he was probably managing his water more ideally suited to our substrate, which had a slightly higher airspace than his standard substrate. So I don't think there's anything probably other than that going on that would contribute to the differences he was seeing in rooting. But they finished the 5,000 plants. They did have to do 2 extra liquid feeds. The grower told me on this crop versus his standard substrate, so that would account for, some of the nitrogen immobilization that may have been going on. But the crop was finished, went to market, sold, and with no issues at all. A colleague, actually a former colleague when I was at USDA, Dr. Anthony Witcher, was approached by grower Ferns. And that grower Ferns was interested, had heard about the work we had done, and was interested as to whether this product could have application in his production. So Dr. Witcher undertook a study looking at fern production. As you see in this picture, the plant that's circled there in red is a substrate with a very high inclusion rate of whole tree. I believe that was 80%. And no real data to present to you on this except for a picture. And this is that same shot in that greenhouse, the same plant in this study. And you see that regardless of substrate, all of these plants finished. They were all watered the same. They were all managed the same from a fertility standpoint. After several replicated studies, we began to see a pattern of inconsistency in our results. And it was primarily in studies where we included very high inclusion rates of whole tree. We had always considered the reduced growth that we saw in the high inclusion rates to be primarily a result of nitrogen immobilization or nitrogen drawdown, and secondarily probably related to maybe water management. But the pattern we were seeing, or we've been seeing over several crops, several different studies, it was not consistent. So after some thorough discussions and reevaluating our procedures, we began to suspect that it was something that was related to the processing and handling, specifically how the whole tree was used and when it was used after final processing. So we began a series of studies, both growth studies and some bioassays, germinating seeds, where we were evaluating what we called fresh whole tree versus an aged whole tree. And aged was simply where the whole tree had been processed and stored for a length of time. And so the study you see here in this picture is a petunia, which I think is pretty obvious there. And on the left is what we're calling fresh whole tree. Now, let me just explain to you how fresh this was. That petunia, when on the afternoon, was planted as a plug into that pot, and it was 100% whole tree. No, actually, I believe it was 80% whole tree. The morning before, that morning, the whole tree that was placed in that container was actually a tree growing in the forest. So it was extremely fresh the same day. It was harvested, processed, mixed as a substrate, and the petunias were planted in that substrate. Compared to the picture on the right, was whole tree that had been processed 60 days prior. So after several studies evaluating plant growth, monitoring, processing, and handling, we determined that the whole tree is best in the system that we were using, placed in bulk bags after final processing, and then it be held in those bags for a minimum of 3 weeks. Now, why did we make that decision? Well, we looked at several different methods of processing and handling. And in the bulk bag method, we installed data loggers at various places inside the bags, replicated this. And what we found, and it varies based on time of year, but what we found in general was that once the whole tree has gone through final processing and placed inside these bulk bags, that we saw a pretty rapid increase in the temperature inside the bag. And that increase, again, happened pretty rapidly. As you can see in this chart for this particular data set, from day 1 to about day 11, we had an increase in the substrate temperature from about 85 degrees up to close to 180 degrees. But that was followed by almost an equal rapid decrease in temperature and what we termed a stabilization of the product. And again, it depends on time of year. This particular data set was done in the spring. We see that this process happens quicker in the warmer times of year, in other words, in the summer, than it would happen in the winter. And these bags are held outside. Although we don't yet completely understand all the processes that are involved here, there's likely some microbial degradation of some easily digestible sugars is taking place. The result of that microbial activity is giving us the heat that's being generated. During that heating process, we feel that there are some volatilization of terpenes that are known to exist in wood fiber such as this whole tree, and that possibly are what we are having the negative effect on plant growth. We really feel like that's the case because of some of the seedling bioassays that we did on some extractions from the fresh whole tree. But what is clear is that if it's handled in this manner, and we did multiple studies following up this, that if it is handled in this manner, we didn't see any more negative effects associated that we were seeing when it was used fresh. So another concern we have, and this is related to earlier, the buffering capacity, is what effect different nitrogen forms would have on substrate pH. We know that there's little buffering capacity in this whole tree product when it's compared to a peat product, and so we're concerned about this effect. So it's pretty much widely known that the form of nitrogen used can affect substrate pH, but our question was, at what degree does it affect pH in whole tree when used at high inclusion rates? So we undertook a study where we evaluated 100% whole tree with a peat light standard. We fertilized with a continuous liquid feed using nitrogen form, using our sources of nitrogen from either 100% nitrate nitrogen. We had 5 treatments. The second treatment was a 25% nitrate, 75% ammoniacal. Our third treatment was a 50-50 nitrate and ammoniacal. We had a 25 nitrate, 75 ammoniacal, and then 100% ammoniacal nitrogen. We ran this study with petunias for about 30 days. And first I'll show you the results of pH on the, so here's a chart showing the pH of the peat light substrate. And we saw what we expected, that by the end of the 30 days, we saw slightly higher or slightly elevated pH with the nitrate nitrogen and the lowest pH with the 100% ammoniacal nitrogen. So that was expected. What was kind of shocking to us was what we saw with 100% whole tree. We knew we would see a difference. We didn't realize we would see quite a difference. So then again, after 30 days, Our substrate pH went from about 6 to about 7.5 when fertilized with a nitrate. Actually, it's closer to about 7.7 when fertilized with a nitrate nitrogen, and down to about 5.2 when fertilized with an ammoniacal nitrogen. So the take home to this is that with as you increase the inclusion rate of whole tree, or for that matter, probably any wood fiber substrate, you do need to be concerned about pH management, and you need to pay real close attention to your source of nitrogen, as well as other factors such as water, alkalinity, that might have an effect on substrate pH. Again, because as you increase the inclusion rate, you're lowering your buffering capacity.
Glenn, can I pop in with a quick question on this slide?
Sure.
Have you done this test across different crops to notice that different crops, the pH changes differently?
We have done it across different crops, and yes, the answer to your question is yes, we do see the crop does affect it, but we still see the same trends. We see a much more pronounced pH change as we increase the inclusion rate versus a lower inclusion rate or a non-inclusion rate in a standard mix.
It looks like it would be easy to figure out how to land at the 6 to 6.5, fairly optimum range, and stick with that ratio and be consistent across all your crops. Or do you need to keep consistent testing and adjusting?
Well, yeah, I think you do need to consistently monitor often. But while at one hand you think that the low buffering capacity, could create some problems for you, and that this pH can move. The benefit of that low buffering capacity is if your pH if you have high inclusion rates and your pH does get out of line because it has a low buffering capacity, it's easy to bring it back into an acceptable range. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Now, so here's the picture. So, as you might expect, petunia does not really like to grow at a nearly 8 pH. So the petunia in the upper left-hand corner would certainly not be acceptable in that situation. But again, you're monitoring. Our advice is to, if you do use high inclusion rates, to monitor your pH, and a grower's never going to let it get to that point before a correction is going to be made. So, whole tree substrates, where are we? Well, it's basically not commercially available, and I guess, to be frankly honest, I'm not extremely optimistic that it ever will be. There are many factors that I think that contribute to that. Some are related to potential market of such a product, and probably primarily also related to the cost to ship such a product. The whole tree product has a fairly high bulk density. It does not compress well, so shipping would be an issue, and it might limit the range of that market. So basically, currently, a grower that wanted to use this would have to produce their own, which is what the grower that we've worked with is doing. I know there are several other growers, large growers, that are doing that. It's going to take considerable capital investment in equipment and facilities. You would have the problem of sourcing the biomass. You would have just the problem of fitting the processing and handling into your operation. So this was very frustrating to me, because we had a lot of growers who were interested in using high wood fiber substrates, whether it was from whole tree or pine tree substrate, as is being researched at NC State, or just some other source, but it just wasn't available at that time in the U.S. And then I happened to be at a meeting at a grower, kind of a brainstorming meeting one winter, late winter before spring season, and there was a well-known industry consultant there, and he introduced me to a product that he had seen that was being developed by Profile that was potentially going to be released in the market. This product was called HydraFiber. And so I was very intrigued. I contacted Profile and expressed my interest in evaluating this product. And that's kind of where the relationship with HydraFiber started. And so I'll at this point, I'll turn it over to Daniel and let Daniel give you an overview of HydraFiber and then kind of speak as to how we got started working together. So Daniel?
Yep. Thanks, Dr. Fain. Appreciate it. So yeah, as you mentioned, we met in early 2016. We had some initial discussions. We were very excited to be working with you, because we had followed pretty closely a lot of your work that you had done with Whole Tree as well as several other academics, and we just felt that with HydraFiber it was a really exciting product because, as you said, the marketability of Whole Tree substrate or pine tree substrate or a lot of these other products, it's really left up to the grower to do this. And so we've got a product that I think overcomes some of these barriers for the grower. And so just briefly, for those of you who are not too familiar with HydraFiber, some of you may be, but I want to kind of go over some of the basic facts about it. HydraFiber is made just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. It's made entirely from loblolly pine or southern yellow pine, and that decision was largely made based on the research that Dr. Fain and Dr. Jackson and Dr. Wright and others have done. And the general consensus in academia is that loblolly not only has the most research behind it, but it's one of the best tree species to use. It's also, for anybody who is familiar with the Southeast United States, widely forested tree. It's used widely for lumber and paper. So there's very ample supply in this area. And we source all of our wood chips within, or most of them, within a 75-mile radius of our plant just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. This product, the way that we're refining it, it's very lightweight, and it also compresses very well. So, Dr. Fain had mentioned earlier that Whole Tree substrate tends to have a very high bulk density. That's due to higher density of the material as well as usually higher water content. And so through our manufacturing process, which I'll get to in a minute, we can lower the weight. We can also create these highly singulated fibers, which are very light and fluffy. You can see an example of our HydraFiber 365 on the right-hand side of this slide, and you can see it has a very cottony texture to it. The other thing about HydraFiber is it's also OMRI listed, so it can be used in organic production. So now what we're seeing here is an aerial shot of our plant outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. And just want to walk through you briefly our manufacturing process. So I mentioned on the last slide that we source the bulk of our chips within a 75-mile radius of our plant. We source the chips from sawmills that only cut loblolly pine. So that's one of the checks that we have in place to guarantee that we have a sole wood source for HydraFiber. The chip is essentially a pulp spec chip. It's virgin material. So what happens is the lumber mill will debark the logs. Then they will, when they're cutting the logs into planks, planks are typically square. So they have a bunch of trim wood that's left over after they square up the planks. That trim wood is then chipped. And again, it's a pulp spec. It's roughly a 1 by 1 inch chip. That comes in trucks. We accept trucks 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. We consume a tremendous amount of wood on an annual basis. Those trucks will come in. On the lower right-hand portion of the aerial shot, you'll see two truck dumps. The trailers would be backed up there. They would get dumped, and then the chips would proceed to go through a deck screener where they're sized and graded. And then they would be transported to our chip yard where they would be segregated and piled by chip species. So then when we're ready to make Hydrofiber, we use a bucket loader. We take the chips and we fill bins that are on weigh scales. These bins will then meter the chips into our refiner. And our refiner is, we also call it a digester, the easiest way to describe it is really a giant pressure cooker. And so if you see the cyclones where the steam is coming out of the top there, that would be, as part of the refining process. So if we go to the next slide, we have a very simple diagram of our refining process. So once the chips are metered into our digester, we then use very high temperatures, hundreds of degrees, pressure, steam. We are actually to the point of where the lignin is melting. And the purpose of this is really to soften the chip prior to the defibering process. The defibering process, after it comes out of the digester, it would then go through a pair of plates, which are about 48 inches in diameter. One plate is stationary, one plate rotates. And we can control the fiber size based on how close or far apart those two plates are from one another. And so from there, we can create multiple SKUs. And then the next step is it goes through our drying process, which we take it from a very wet moisture content down to about 20% moisture content by weight. And that happens in a matter of seconds. There's a second heating process that occurs there. And the two heating processes that our chips go through serves as really two purposes. Number one, it effectively sterilizes the product. So what the grower gets is completely sterilized. There's no weeds, no pathogens, so that when you open those bales and you start to make mixes with it, then you know what you're starting with, and you don't need to worry about those risks. The other issue too, and we're actively pursuing research with this, and this kind of dovetails with what Dr. Fain had mentioned earlier with the aged versus unaged, is we have or we believe currently that this heating process is helping to volatilize and remove some of the sugars and carbohydrates during the refining process, which is essentially helping to stabilize and make the wood so that there's no nothing in there that could cause issues with plant growth. So in other words, we're basically taking the risk out of it for use. And also it's, Dr. Fain, I think you mentioned 60 days aging time in the study that you referred to earlier. It's basically a way of fast aging it without having to compost it. So that's advantageous. And then the grower also is not tying up valuable production space to age the wood fiber itself. So anyways, after it comes out of our dryer, it then goes to our baggers where we compress it into 50-pound bales. These bales are very dense, and they also expand 13x. So one bale will actually yield out over a cubic yard of fiber. So it is extremely efficient to ship, and we ship all over the world. And just to, for perspective, we get asked all the time, so how much will one truckload of Hydrofiber yield to? And so in general, it's about one truckload would equal about 5 truckloads of peat moss or about 8 truckloads of perlite, just to put that in perspective. So this next slide here is just talking about chemical characteristics. We currently offer 5 fiber SKUs. They're here on the left-hand side of the slide, 065 to 510. And you may be saying, well, what's the difference in all the SKUs with the numbers? Essentially, the smaller the number, the finer the fiber or shorter the fiber, whereas the larger the number is coarser fiber. But regardless of which fiber size you choose, chemically speaking, they're all virtually the same. The pH is somewhat acidic at about 4.5. That's slightly higher typically than what peat is, but it's also lower than something like coconut coir is. But one thing to mention, and again, this goes back to what Dr. Fain had discussed earlier with regards to pH management and some of the studies that they've done, is like whole tree, because Hydrofiber is a wood-based product. Through the studies we've done with Dr. Dixon at University of New Hampshire, as well as some studies that we've done with Dr. Fain, basically it is very low cation exchange capacity, which means that it's very easy to adjust the pH with wood fiber. And it actually, from our research that we've done, it behaves very similar in the substrate to how perlite does. And again, it goes back to low cation exchange. And so our recommendation to growers is that if you're substituting perlite for Hydrofiber, you really don't need to make any change to your lime rate. But when you start replacing peat with Hydrofiber, our rule of thumb is that for every 10% peat that you replace with Hydrofiber, you should reduce your lime rate by 10%. So moving on to this next slide that I have here is reviewing the physical characteristics for Hydrofiber. So the way this table is set up, we have all 5 SKUs across the top of the table. They're organized from the finest fiber on the left-hand side with 065, and then you get progressively coarser as you move across the right. And the first row there is for total porosity. So total porosity in terms of physical properties, what that means is those are the pores that are either allocated to water space or air space. Okay, so they're basically just pores. Okay, and the interesting thing here is that regardless of what fiber size, we're well over 90%, and even in some instances, we're approaching almost 100% total porosity. Okay, and so what this means is that when we add this in with other substrate components, typically we're not sacrificing water holding capacity, and while we're not sacrificing it, we're also in many instances actually increasing airspace. And there's not a lot of other raw materials that can do that. And that goes down to the way we're refining. We're very efficiently singulating the fibers out and teasing them apart with our refining process. Then of the total porosity, our container capacity, or also known as water holding capacity, it makes sense that our finest fiber has roughly about 50% water holding capacity. It also has our highest amount of water holding. And then as you get progressively coarser, it makes sense that you reduce your water holding capacity. And then there's an inverse relationship with regards to air filled porosity, in that the largest fibers is going to have the most airspace, whereas the finest fibers are going to have the least amount of airspace. So we often get the question, well, what fiber size is right for me? In most instances, we recommend that people start with 160 because from our experience and the trials that we've done, it seems to be the most seamless transition for the grower to make. It has the best balance of water holding to airspace when you make the final blend, again, in most instances. But that being said, you have to ask your question, what kind of physical properties are you looking for, as well as what kind of crops are you growing? In terms of physical properties, if your goal is to maximize shelf life and you're growing mostly bedding plants, then something like 065 would probably be what we would steer you towards. However, if you are growing trees and shrubs, we would steer you towards more of the 365 to the 510. Again, the strategy that we're going for here is very similar to what Dr. Fain described at the beginning of the presentation, where he showed you the different various grind sizes of whole tree. And essentially, we're kind of doing the same thing with the 5 different SKUs. And within these 5 different SKUs, we're providing enough options that cover really the full gamut of physical properties and crop types that most of our customers are doing. And so, when we first met Dr. Fain in 2016, again, because of his expertise with wood-based substrates, specifically whole tree substrate, we really thought that the first step in this relationship in the initial studies that we should do with him would be really just comparing equal percentages of hydrofiber with equal percentages of whole tree substrate, and just seeing how, what are the differences, if any. And so I'll turn it over to Dr. Fain here.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I thought I was muted there. So, so I was very interested when I first saw the product. It physically very, very different than the whole tree product we were working with. So, as Daniel said, in our discussions, the first series of studies we wanted to do was just compare in equal percentages the whole tree to the hydrofiber. And so on the slide here is one of our first studies where we basically went up to a 40% inclusion rate and compared that to a peat light substrate. And we also used two different nitrogen or fertilizer rates. So we grew two crops in this initial study, petunia and marigold. For the petunias, we fertilized at a constant liquid feed of either 200 parts per million or 100 parts per million. And with the marigolds, either 125 parts per million or 75 parts per million. And we used a 20-10-20 for the petunia and a 15-3-16 for the marigold. And again, I'm not going to show you a lot of data. I'm just going to show you some pictures. And pleasantly, what we discovered was that the hydrofiber and the whole tree both performed equally as well. You see with the 100 parts per million petunia here, we did have slightly smaller plants than we did with the 200 parts per million, but they were basically equal across all the different inclusion rates. Similarly with marigold, we saw basically the same results, that we didn't really see any marketable difference for sure. We may have had some slight statistical differences in biomass, but basically all plants were produced and were marketable at the end of the study. Now, one of the things that I was really curious about early on after seeing the actual hydrofiber product would be how the physical properties were going to compare to the whole tree substrate. So we actually started doing a study or a test where we're actually evaluating the water holding capacity of the substrates at the end of production. So we actually developed a technique that we use to measure water holding capacity at the end of production. And as you can see in this slide, that we had basically equal water holding capacities across all of the substrates, which was good because that kind of eliminates the water management kind of part of or any differences we see based on any water management practice. And so when we can set up our experiments where we have similar water holding capacities, then we kind of eliminate that factor as being a variable that might give us a difference, and can focus more on the product itself and look at other parameters. Another thing that we started doing, Daniel and the folks at HydraFiber were very, very interested in could we do any evaluation of roots. And we had done basically some subjective evaluation where we just developed a scale of rooting, and we would visually inspect the roots and try to assign a number based on what we were visually seeing. Well, in this particular study, we had a piece of software we used where we took a picture of basically the interface between the substrate and the container. So we'd remove the container off the plant. We used a square pot, and we would take a digital image of multiple sides of the pot, and then we would analyze that image, digitize it, and the software actually counts pixels. It determines what's a root. It counts pixels of that root. And in this particular study, we saw good rooting with everything, but actually the 70-30 peat Hydrofiber gave us a slightly more pixels. And again, this is just at the substrate surface. It does not evaluate internal rooting, but it is kind of a good indication of rooting and a way to try to measure rooting. This is the kind of the visual picture of once we've taken that picture and digitized it, what those images look like. And you can see we had really good rooting in everything for all treatments. Another study we undertook was they were real interested, and we were real interested in high inclusion rates, especially with poinsettia crops. So we undertook a study where we went all the way up to 80% inclusion rate with poinsettia, and the next series of images are just going to be the results of that study, which we really saw very, very little difference in anything up to probably the 60% inclusion rate. Here's a picture of the control, which was an 80-20 peat perlite compared to a 70-30 peat Hydrofiber. Here's a picture of the same control with a 60-40, so a 40% inclusion rate of Hydrofiber. 50% inclusion rate of Hydrofiber in this image, and a 60% inclusion rate. And then kind of an overhead shot of those. Again, that's the control with up to a 60% inclusion rate. And we're very pleased, very excited that these plants perform well at that high inclusion rate. We also looked at water holding capacity in this study as well, and actually this study did include, as I mentioned, up to an 80% inclusion rate. And as we expected, once we got above 50%, we did see less water holding capacity at the end of the study. And so any differences that we were seeing in the high inclusion rates, we attributed primarily to water holding capacity, as the crop was basically managed the same from a water management standpoint. So that was real quick, just on a few studies. We've done numerous studies with Hydrofiber in production. We've done numerous annual plants. We've done some perennials, some woody plants. We've done propagation studies, and I can say that wood works. And I'm actually kind of my esteemed colleague, Brian Jackson, kind of coined this term that wood works. He had an article not too long ago where he used this as kind of a title, and it does work. And I think we know that, and we've known that. And it's been shown to work in Europe. It's been shown to work here. And so I'm most excited that we now have an answer to, especially some of our smaller growers who are interested in using wood fiber, were interested. But basically, when I would get that call, I really didn't have an answer for them as to what the source of that material could be for them. So I'm excited about the future of wood fiber substrates, and I think certainly Hydrofiber is a great option, and we're just excited to continue this relationship with Hydrofiber and to continue doing more research to bring wood fiber substrates into the mainstream production. Daniel, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, we could do that, and take some questions. We've got a few rolling in now.
No, I think that was great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, let's see. Well, Eddie wants to know, and there are a lot of questions around the whole tree, and then you dashed everybody's hopes by saying, well, it's not available, but then I think you raised it again by saying, well, we've got this other stuff, this lovely Hydrofiber stuff. Would you call Hydrofiber an improved version of whole tree, Dr. Fain?
Well, I wouldn't call it an improved version of whole tree. It's a different product, a totally different process, as Daniel laid out in his presentation. It's a wood fiber product that works, and it's going to be available, or is available to the industry.
Right, and I think that's the biggest key. It is available now. You can buy it. Well, let's tackle one. Eddie wants to know, he was asking about PGRs with whole tree, but let's take that over to PGRs with whole tree and HydraFiber. And holding capacity, time it remains in the substrate, things like that.
So we have done some work with whole tree and PGRs and soil-drenched PGRs. We've done a couple of studies, one on poinsettia and then on some other annual crops. And we do see a slight difference in I guess in efficacy. And the study we looked at was looking at paclobutrazol or bonsai. So we did see a slight decrease in efficacy when we had a high inclusion rate of whole tree, but I don't have that data in front of me, but nothing that was alarming in the studies that we've looked at.
And Glenn, just I know the question was about whole tree, but with regards to HydraFiber, we have done some studies both internally as well as we did a study a couple of years ago with Michigan State, Dr. Runkle there, looking at bonsai, and the study that we did there showed no differences in substrates with HydraFiber versus just peat-light substrates. The internal studies that we've done have been the same as well. And I would also add that, just talking with, our current customers, I think the general consensus would be that they haven't adjusted their PGR rates. So, great question.
And Daniel, to add to that, we some of the early work that was done years ago, looking at PGRs and substrates, indicated that pine bark could tie up or could reduce, if you had a high amount of pine bark in your substrate, it could reduce the efficacy of some of the bonsai. And so with us in whole tree, because it is a whole tree, we have a much higher percentage of pine bark in that product than you would see in HydraFiber. So that could be the reason we saw a slight decrease in efficacy. It could be strictly related to the content of pine bark that's in the whole tree versus what's in the HydraFiber, and the reason that they're not seeing that in the HydraFiber.
Yep.
All right, got another question here. Did you adjust the fertilizer applications as you went into higher percentages of wood fiber?
Okay, who's that question for?
Probably you and your research, I think.
Okay, well, I mean, we've looked at, we've done numerous studies where we do look at various different fertilizer rates. And I guess the short answer to that is when we do get into high inclusion rates with the whole tree, we have recommended either an adjustment on the front end with an increase in your starter nutrient charge and the various different products and methods of application. We've looked at that, or a slight increase in your liquid feed if you're at a high inclusion rate. If you're at 20 to 40%, and again, I'm speaking mostly with a whole tree here, then we haven't really seen any need to change your nutritional management. And I'd say from the HydraFiber standpoint, Daniel can jump in here, but what we haven't seen any, at those inclusion rates, haven't seen any need to.
I think the poinsettia trials that we did, the two where we looked at inclusion rate, I think we fed everything the same. If I remember correctly, I don't remember off the top of my head.
Yes, correct. We
did. It was probably around 150 to, I think it was under 200 parts per million. So I mean, it's definitely pretty standard rates. And And then I would say anecdotally from the field, um, most of our customers are not reporting any change to feed, and most of our customers are starting at 30%, and we have several customers who are either growing in full production at 40, 50%, or trialing those percentages, and they found that they haven't had to make any changes. So again, that's kind of been our experience.
All right, we've got a couple of vegetable-oriented questions. First, can you use HydraFiber for vegetable plugs? I suppose it probably depends upon the plug size and how small a fiber you can get into that plug size. But talk about propagating in HydraFiber, especially vegetables.
Yeah, I mean, so we haven't done any I guess third-party university trials specifically looking at that on vegetables themselves, but we have done with several of our partners. I know Dr. Fain, we've done some propagation trials, mostly with liners or cuttings. But we have done some seed studies and germination studies, and there's no issues. In fact, we did a trial with coir in the Netherlands, Wageningen University, and basically through their bioassay test, they found that there's no issue germinating seeds compared to their controls. So as far as germinating various genetics in HydraFiber, there's no issue. But the thing, it comes down to what Chris was alluding to here a second ago, is it really comes down to what's the container size that you're germinating in. In general, fill of very small cells tends to be an issue, like with a 512 or a 288. So you either need to work with 10 or maybe 20% HydraFiber in that instance. But if you're using like a larger cell size, like a 72, a 105, something, typically anything larger than a 98 or an 88 cell tray, then you're probably going to be okay and not going to run into any issues with regards to fill. So it's not a matter of the genetics and how it's going to germinate. It's really just more of an issue of what tray size are you using, and can your equipment adequately fill that.
All right. Along the same lines, finished hydroponic leafy vegetable production, probably hydroponic lettuce, maybe where you're going to use it instead of rock wool. Martin wants to know about that. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Again, this has been, most of our focus has been on the ornamental side. That being said, we do have some folks who are doing some organic production with vegetables that have experimented on their own with HydraFiber, and we've seen, they've been able to do it successfully all the way up to 100% HydraFiber with not any issue. But currently we don't have any products that are geared towards like an NFT setup or something like that. But absolutely, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't work. And again, some of the customers that we've worked with have reported that it's been a viable option in their own internal testing.
All right. And even further afield, Marion wants to know about using it as a substitute for sphagnum moss in orchid or carnivorous plant production. Looks like some more research opportunities here.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. As far as was in Europe recently, and there visited an orchid grower over there who was experimenting using 100% HydraFiber as their growing medium, and they were very happy with the results that they were having there. They're traditionally using bark, and one of the comments that they had made, and one of the issues is a root larva that has been a problem for orchid production over there. And one of the observations that they've made, again, it's anecdotal, but they have had fewer root issues or virtually no root issues in the plants that they've been growing in 100% HydraFiber versus the bark. So certainly an opportunity there. As far as carnivorous plants, I'll be honest, that's we haven't evaluated it for that particular aspect, but I think it would be very possible.
Oh, sorry, I was muted there. Last question. Daniel, what's the biggest adjustment that that customers have to make when switching over or adding Hydrofiber into their mix?
You know, that's a really great question, and I think it's probably the answer is something common, and I would say it's water management. And it really comes down to visual cues. And you know, Dr. Fain, I don't know if you've seen this with you know, poultry, but one of the observations that we've made is that we get a lot of surface drying with Hydrofiber. So basically, you'll get if you will, a crust of the top, you know, let's say ½ inch or so of the media. And so if the growers are not in the habit of, you know, pulling the pots off, evaluating the roots, they may have, the tendency is that they could potentially overwater the plant. Thankfully, Hydrofiber tends to be a very forgiving substrate to grow in, you know, because we're typically providing additional airspace in addition to what most growers were using before they made the switch. But still, I mean, overwatering can be a problem. And so it's really about, you know, helping to train the grower to, you know, look at the roots, pick up pods to determine if there's still adequate water in there before they come back and water again. And, you know, rooting is highly correlated with oxygen in the soil. So the better you manage your water, the better you're going to, you know, help with root development. So I would say that's probably the number one thing. After that, it would be pH management, which I touched on earlier, and then lastly, it would be container fill. And those are all things that we'd be happy to help them with.
Well,
I would agree with Daniel. I'm sorry, no, I would agree with Daniel, especially from the water management. One of the, I guess, the obstacles we had when we had high inclusion rates, a lot of growers that we were working with, they do use visual. You know, they're looking at the substrate surface, and when you dramatically change what that substrate surface looks like, then they kind of lose that visual cue. So just, you know, our encouragement is, you know, pick your containers up, take, you know, visually look, feel, see what's going on in that substrate. Don't just use that container surface as your indicator of what the water status is for that crop.
All right, very good. Well, it's a fairly new product, new technology, lots of opportunity here. So if you want to ask some more questions, maybe give Hydrofiber a try. I know Daniel will certainly be willing to hook you up and help you out, as will Dr. Fain. So if you've got questions for them, there are their email addresses. As always, and as promised, we are going to archive the webinar as soon as it's done. Same place you sign up, GrowerTalks.com/webinars. And while you're there, check out what I've got coming up in the future. So that said, for Dr. Fain and his Auburn Tigers, for Daniel and his mobile broadcast studio, and on behalf of all my staff at Ball Publishing who work hard so I don't have to, I'm Chris Beatty saying, so long, everybody.